Liberté à la Polonaise. I was to have the same contrast emphasized for me in a different way at the opposite end of Europe over the Christmas of 1976. The previous summer, I had been very intrigued by reports of a small-scale but suggestive workers' revolt in the communist Poland, where party property and several stretches of railway line had been extensively damaged in rioting against a sudden announcement from on high of a steep rise in the price of food. Some protesters had been killed and the rest dispersed, and several put on trial. Nothing exceptional in that, but a new element had intruded itself. Petitions had been circulating in Warsaw, soliciting money for a legal defense of the accused workers. Voices had been raised, demanding an inquiry into the conduct of the police and militia during the disturbances. Was it possible that, 20 years after the Polish Spring of 1956, the germinal of another movement from below was underway? Interviewing one of the former leaders of the Portuguese fascist system, Dr. Franco Nogueira, in his office at the amazingly titled Banco Spiritu Santo e Commercial, Bank of the Holy Spirit and Commerce, its grotesque moniker partly explained by a family name. I had been informed by him that it was relatively easy to keep Portugal and its people contained and under control because the country was peculiar in Europe in only having one land frontier. Poland's problem is the exact opposite. It is condemned by geography to live between Germany and Russia, and has been repeatedly invaded, occupied, and partitioned. Not an entirely blameless country. Its forces took part in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia after the British sellout in Munich. In 1939, it was attacked and overrun by both Hitler and Stalin acting in concert. Its borders were redrawn again after 1945. I was late in life to discover that those frontier territories had been the home of my mother's ancestors. And in 1976, the eventual results of the Hitler-Stalin rapacity could be seen in a dingy Russian-backed communist bureaucracy sitting atop a sullen, strongly Catholic people who perhaps only agreed with their rulers in distrusting federal Germany. An old national chestnut asked the question, if the Russians and Germans both attack again, who do you shoot first? Answer, the Germans. Business before pleasure. You can also deduce something about a Pole who answers this question in the other way around. My business, however, was not with the communists or the nationalists, but with the Democrats and the internationalists. At the time, these seemed to be about 10 or 20 in number, barely enough to constitute a minyan. Had they been Jewish, which a few of them, however secular and non-Zionist, actually were, the one I most wished to meet was Jack Curon, author of the Trotskyist Manifesto against the regime that I had so eagerly hawked around Oxford. He was still going, and strongly at that, in a tiny apartment much invigilated by the UB, or Polish Secret Police. Out of this cell of an apartment and other cells like it was to come a replicating system, the Workers' Defense Committee, Komitet Obrony Robotników, or KOR, which would eventually multiply and divide and evolve, perhaps paradoxically, into something more basic and simple, the elementary word and movement Solidarność, or solidarity. Rabbi Tarfon says somewhere that the task can never be quite completed, yet one has no right to give up. Of the comrades I met that bleak winter, many of them veterans of the extremely nasty Polish prison system, none really expected to make more than a small dent in the regime. Yet to an outsider like myself, there did seem to be a faint nimbus of optimism, visible on the very edge of a dark and cold star. It was, to put in another way, quite astonishing to see how much and to what an extent the party state depended on lies. Small lies and big lies, petty lies, hardly worth telling, that would shame a nose-picking, whining, guilty child, and huge lies that would cause a hardened blackmailer and perjurer to blush a bit. To give an example of the paltry sort, the Chilean communist leader, Luis Corvalin, had recently been swapped in a piece of overt Cold War horse trading for the Soviet dissident Vladimir Bukovsky. No evident disgrace in that, perhaps, but the Polish communist press insisted only on reporting the release of Korwalin, and only as the outcome of a campaign, international proletarian solidarity. In a time of BBC and other broadcasts, and with many Poles having family overseas, the chances of such falsification being believed were exactly nil. Yet such a crass falsification was the everyday currency of the Polish media. On the macro scale, it was still officially true that the mass graves of Katyn across the Belarus border, in which the corpses of tens of thousands of Polish officers had been hastily interred in the 1940s, were the responsibility of the Nazis. But there simply wasn't a single person in the whole of Poland who credited this disgusting untruth. Not even those paid to spread it believed it. My American Trotskyist girlfriend and I had been told by friends that the thing to take to Warsaw was blue jeans, which had totemic value on the black market. We accordingly packed several old, patched, worn-out pairs. We scrounged a bed from my old Oxford comrade, Christopher Babinski, who was then just beginning his stellar career as a reporter from his homeland. As an interpreter, he provided us with a lovely Barbara Kopek, who held down a daytime job in the Palace of Culture that dominated the main square of the city. It had been built as a personal gift from Joseph Stalin to the people of Poland, and in its form and shape expressed all the good taste and goodwill that such benevolence might have implied. It wasn't much fun working inside the building, as Barbara remarked, but at least it meant she didn't have to look at the damn thing. When we went to meet Jacek Kuron in his tiny cluttered apartment, this tough and stocky fellow punctured one of my illusions right away, by saying that he no longer had any illusions about Trotskyism. The real terrain of struggle was for democratic liberties and the rule of law, and even as we spoke, we were continually reminded of the distance to be traveled towards this goal. At regular intervals, Kuron's phone would ring and he would be subjected to spontaneous abuse. In an effort to spook him, a death threat had been anonymously delivered, with a countdown of 100 days. It stood at 65 to go on the day of our visit. And the besetting sin of Polish public life, anti-Semitism, was in evidence as well. He showed and read me a violently Jew-hating letter sent to him by registered mail. The sender had then delivered another letter, this time by hand, confessing that the first missive had been dictated to him in a police station. This showed a real sickness in the communist system, not just because of the use of bigotry as a provocation, but because anti-Semitism had historically always been used by the Polish right wing against the Reds. It took real calcified cynicism to employ such a weapon of reaction against dissent. It would have been even nastier if Jacek Kuron had actually been Jewish, but the fact that he wasn't, Polish or other Jewish baiters have been known to operate without possessing the raw material of any actual Jews to work with. In their pedantic way, the post-war communists had tried to rebuild Warsaw as an exact replica of its pre-war self. Some of this was soulless and dull, but there was heavy snow that Christmas, and I found the icy city rather hypnotizing. We went to the nearby township of Kazimierz, once a center of Jewish life before the nearly clean sweep that had been made of Polish Jewry. We attended a midnight mass in Wilno, where the congregation was so densely packed that it spilled out of doors. With worshippers kneeling in the drifts, I could not understand much of the sermon, but it didn't seem to be delivered in the emetic, emollient tones of the Second Vatican Council. Polish Catholicism, often a historic ally of extremist politics, also had its collaborationist side with a semi-official group known as Pax Christi, sitting in the rubber-stamp parliament. But that Christmas, Cardinal Wyszynski gave a rather decent and spirited sermon, making quite strong statements about the repression of strikers. Everybody got to hear about it, but the official press didn't report a single line of the homily, thus underlining, yet again, the self-defeating character of lying and censorship. Self-sabotaging might be a better term. One of the strikes in the port city of Stettin had been provoked when the shipyard workers read the Communist Party paper that they had all volunteered to work longer hours in the interest of production. One of the leaders of that strike, a man named Edmund Baluka, later told me that he had been sent as a soldier into Czechoslovakia during the Warsaw Pact aggression of August 1968. He had been told and had believed that he was going to repel a West German invasion of Prague. Discovering a complete absence of Germans in the country, except for East German soldiers who were also taking part in the Russian-sponsored occupation, had destroyed his entire faith in anything the party ever said. Baluka, too, was for some time to associate himself with Trotskyism. Our young friends in the KOR invited us for a Christmas Eve feast in a cold but cheery apartment. There was a great deal to eat and drink, but I suddenly noticed, with an inner qualm, that everything, every loaf and sausage, cheese and bottle, was the last third or quarter of itself. It was clear that in the interest of hospitality, all the odds and ends and saved-up leftovers were being deployed. I was glad to be able to produce a parcel of blue jeans, and I don't remember a gift ever going so well. "Are you sure you can spare all of these?" we were asked, as if we were parting with a fortune. On the black market, this can raise a huge amount for the committee. There was also the eagerly discussed hope that the KOR could start an underground publishing house, to print, among other things, the works of George Orwell. This did later happen, with a Samizdat imprint called Noah. Even so, and keen as I was on the latter idea especially, I urged them to keep back at least something of our gift for themselves. They remained self-denyingly serious. Though I think it was decided that Barbara should have a pair of her very own, if only to show off a bit of style in the Stalinist wedding cake that was her office building. In later years, as the strikes burgeoned and spread and the Polish working class outlived both the Polish Communist Party, as in Portugal, the attempt of that party to stay in power by using the army, I like to imagine those blue jeans as having acted as one of the pebbles that began the historical avalanche. My ability to carry my liquor was very useful on that trip, as it has been on several other voyages. The heartily jovial and inspiring evening ended with a drinking bout challenge to me from a young comrade named Witold. 2 lines of shot glasses were arranged down each side of the dining table, and filled to the brim with different flavors of Polish vodka, including my own then favorite, Zubrowka, tinted a palish green by the buffalo grass that grows in the east of the country. Last man to the finish line was a sissy. I do not actually remember whether I beat Witold or whether it was a dead heat, but I remember a rush of pride at his fraternal embrace, and also his exclaiming, "Christoph, tu es un vrai Polonaise." It was a title of honor. This trip was also to yield me another of those life-altering eparchas. It came from Adam Michnik, one of the founders of the KOR, and later one of the chief intellectuals of Solidarnosc, and later still, and to this day, a leading figure in the academic and publishing life of his country. When I met him, he was already a veteran of numerous victimizations and imprisonments. His troubles had begun in 1966, when he was expelled from the university for organizing a seminar for Professor Leszek Kolakowski. Having a Jewish father, but not a Jewish mother, he could easily have passed, but preferred to describe himself as a Pole of Jewish descent. He was then definitely of the secular left, and had been impressed by the way that in Franco Spain, civil society had been able to build up parallel institutions that could gradually and organically replace the deliquescent absolutist state. This was very much the model that many of Poland's oppositionists were to follow. I mentioned to him at our first meeting that Jacek Kuron thought the next wave of protests wouldn't be very socialistic, because the word had been so much discredited by communist rule. Michnik wasn't so sure. After all, freedom and democracy are words that have been discredited by governments as well, but we do not abandon them for that reason. The real struggle for us is for the citizen to cease to be the property of the state. I knew as I wrote it down and underlined it that last sentence was a pregnant one, that its implications for all political positions were enormous, and that in order to stay true to the principle, once again, the principle of consistent anti-totalitarianism, one might have to expose oneself to steadily mounting contradictions. I was to see Adam Michnik on and off through the long transformation of Poland, and watch him emerge as an honored historian and politician, as well as the editor of perhaps the country's most respected newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza, which had begun life as an illegal strike sheet. One of the juiciest pleasures of life is to be able to salute and embrace, as elected leaders and honored representatives, people whom you first met when they were on the run or in exile, or like Adam, in and out of jail. I was to have this experience again, and I hope to have it many more times in the future. It sometimes allows me to feel that life is full of point.